You are listening to MSP 1337. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. First and foremost, I'd like to thank our sponsor, MSP-Ignite. MSP-Ignite offers a peer group experience that is unique to managed service providers in the technology industry. If you are serious about implementing a model for success through sharing and collaboration of best practices, this is the best way to do it. Head on over to msp-ignite.com to get more information. All right, on to the show. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of MSP 1337, a look at Zero Trust. I'm joined this week by Bryan Sullo of Clock Tower Technology Services. Thanks for joining us, Bryan.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you for having me back.
So we did take a stab at this conversation a little bit ago, but because I am so good with technology, I failed to hit the record button. So for those of you out there listening, this is a well-rehearsed episode of MSP 1337. Bryan, Zero Trust is a conversation topic that started with you and I a few weeks back over Teams. More recently, we had a town hall for the MSP-Ignite members, and one of the topics in that discussion was tied to Zero Trust. And the eye-opener for me, and perhaps all of us, was that Zero Trust doesn't necessarily mean to you and I what it means to our friends over at NIST. So for our audience, could you please give a paraphrase or summary of what NIST has called out Zero Trust?
Yeah, absolutely. So the traditional, if you want to call it that, the perimeter-based security model is, how do I keep the bad guys out? Which sounds logical, right? That's what you want to do. The Zero Trust model is more, how do I operate assuming that the bad guys are already inside the perimeter? Or assuming that my devices and my data are traveling outside my secure perimeter. So what are the things that you need to do to secure your data and your systems? If you can't, I don't want to say if you can't rely on your perimeter, but if you're assuming that the bad guys are already in there, you're assuming breach, basically.
Well, this is the trust. This is trust, right? Like, if we think about it, the way NIST is saying it is that this is no longer just about the perimeter or the network, and it's no longer just about devices or hosts that are part of that network, that the focus has shifted to assets, resources, and people, right? So I think about like a 365 account is an asset or a resource that I as a person consume, but it doesn't live inside my sort of corporate bound ecosystem, right? It lives elsewhere. In fact, it's actually maintained to a degree by somebody else altogether that isn't necessarily even affiliated with my company. Thanks, Microsoft. They do pieces of that, maintaining the operational integrity, of that product. So I think that you and I both have concerns or see this as a fundamentally flawed, maybe naming convention to what I think it first comes to mind when someone says Zero Trust. Would you kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. So there's somebody, I don't know if you've heard of him. He's big in the security space. His name's Steve Gibson. But I listen to him quite a bit, and he has an analogy. He says, if you really want absolute security between two people, you both have to be naked in the middle of a field, whispering in each other's ears.
That sounds more like intimacy than security. just throwing that out there.
But it really illustrates the point that to be absolutely certain that no one is eavesdropping, nobody is, reading your lips, nobody has a microphone pointed at you or something hidden in their pocket. That's about it.
Anything you call that full transparency? Is that full?
Yeah, I think that would be the name for that. But other than that, anything less than that, Well, you do have to have some element of trust.
Right.
You're trusting that, somebody doesn't have a recording device in their pocket. You're trusting that you're not in a place where you're being listened to. Now that's a real world kind of analogy.
So
But
does
I
that
think
factor into how we come to what are the components that we're going to use to say that we both agree that we're in trust mode because we're both using the same criteria to define trust?
well, I guess that's the big question, isn't it? Is what are the criteria you use to define trust?
Right. Well, before we get into the trust component and what I think as MSPs and more of this model that says I can't strip away things that far to then rebuild on an environment that you probably don't have the time to spend at that level to do that degree of verification. And quite honestly, we're saying I don't believe it's zero, right? Because if this is your client, if these are your people, then there's some elements of trust already there, or we wouldn't have the packaging that you have. But I think it's important to go back in time a little bit to help navigate the idea behind why zero trust, at least in the NIST version, is so important with where we're at today. So we go back 10, 15 years, we talked about this before. You go back in time and the technology and the tools and the business model was really you go to work, you go home. Didn't really care if you had internet at home. Most people 15 years ago or longer, work was kind of left at work in the sense that your desktop computer stayed at work. So we spent a lot of time and energy securing that container that was our workplace, right? Firewall, the network switches, the endpoints, all the stuff we ran on them. Over time and the evolution of laptops becoming affordable and mobile devices becoming, prevalent even over the more traditional desktops in any working environment, we started seeing that those devices were going to environments that we didn't trust and then coming back or staying away and remoting in and potentially all introducing elements or contaminants into the environment, right? You could no longer guarantee that we were going to maintain a clean, safe drinking water when the glass hasn't been washed, kind of thing, right? You're still going to get sick. So you look at that and then you go, okay, well, what changed? Well, a lot of things changed over time, but one of the things that really impacted us all most recently is everybody shifted from an on-prem in the office environment to a work from home model that had many organizations, employees still having to access data in that on-prem environment that used to have sort of an implicit trust in place because if you were on the network, we trusted that you were supposed to be on the network.
Exactly. And that's one of the premises or one of the tenets of zero trust is that the network doesn't get implicit trust. You can't just say, oh, because this device is on the network, it's trusted or it's trusted more than devices that are not on the internal network.
So we spend a lot of time in the MSP-Ignite secure outcomes conversations talking about frameworks and controls. And one can probably make an argument that I don't think there's any framework that doesn't have controls that talk about your asset inventory or some sort of asset management component to it, regardless of if it's a sub-control or a category. If you don't have asset inventory defined to 100%, you probably shouldn't be trusting the network environment anyways, right? You never have 100% trust there, is essentially.
Correct.
So maybe this is a little bit of a segue because I know in the imaginary version of this episode that never happened because it wasn't recorded, we actually were talking about this zero trust and the need to focus more on the people and resources. And I think one of the elements that we forgot to talk about allegedly is control one, which in version 7 was all about authorized and unauthorized assets in an environment. This was the CIS top 20. CIS top 18 really gets into more of your enterprise assets, right? Like what what belongs to the company, we'll say has trust associated with it. If we all would agree that a good asset inventory system is possibly 80% or better, is that a trustworthy network? I mean, can I trust that network?
Yeah, well, I don't know that I'd trust 80%, to be honest, these days.
Let's roll the dice. I have better than 80%. Do you trust the network? I hope you say no.
Yeah, I can't. Absolutely.
Right. So which goes back to the NIST statement, right? That says this has a shift from the inventory of devices and the hardware or the software, and a focus on people, assets, resources, right? It says doesn't necessarily matter where it lives, doesn't necessarily manage what device it's on, but we have to do, say, three things have to be known, and we have to be able to identify that they are appropriately trusted. So I guess that's where this big shift comes into play, where we've gone from a technology saturated space on the network perimeter, securing of the perimeter, to a need to, I think it's the ever, I'm struggling with words, but the flow, the progression of technology evolution has gone from the perimeter and the network and some of that infrastructure to being more about the endpoint, the user, the elasticity of a person and where they are and what they're trying to get to, who they are, as opposed to what device they have.
Yeah. And I think one of the misnomers, and as I think about zero trust, and I want to make it clear, because I didn't do this at the beginning of this recording.
Wait, time out. You can't say it. Bryan, you are a cybersecurity expert. When you are the MSP in a room and there isn't a cybersecurity expert to point at, shake a stick at, or say he's the cybersecurity expert, you are that person when you go into that room because you know more than the other person that's there.
That's true, but I don't want to present myself as, having a particular skill in zero trust. It's not like, that's not something that's.
Come on, Bryan. Can we really say, I mean, we've been on calls with lots of experts on that call.
That's true.
I would say, hey, these are my go-to people for cybersecurity guidance and advice. And I will say pretty definitively, we all had different assumptions, definitions, and ideas around what zero trust is. So being candid, you walked into that same conversation with an argument that I'm going to say is as much of an expert stance on this particular topic than anybody else in the room and their experiences to go with it. Because as of August, I think it was 2020, was the first time any quote organization that we would consider a good go-to for our information actually made it clear that this is the definition that you should all stand by.
That's a very good point.
And I don't agree with their definition.
One of the things I was going to point out is that, as I think about it, one of the things I have to keep myself from doing is thinking of zero trust as just the ever shrinking perimeter.
Right.
So
quite the opposite, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, you can think of it as saying, okay, my perimeter is fractured because I've got people working from home. I've got devices that I don't control. I've got devices coming into my perimeter that I didn't have before. And so now you start to think, okay, well, now I need to make more perimeters and shrink them down. So now they need to be at the device level, or they need to be at the application level. And that's all good. We need to have device level security. We need to have application level security. But that, to me, is not really what zero trust is. Zero trust is more security by policy, by looking at, as you said, not just this person that's connecting happened to know Chris's username and password, but they happen to know they know Chris's username and password, and they're connecting from a device that we would expect Chris to connect from, Maybe with Microsoft 365, for example,
Right.
maybe you've got a branch office, or you've got an office in Ireland, right? So you need to
Right.
keep connections open. You can't geofence Ireland. But I know that in your role, you never travel to Ireland.
Right.
So when you show up connecting from an IP address in Ireland, well, that's a step towards zero trust. If you can say, no, we're not going to allow Chris to connect from there because that's not where he normally connects from.
Well, I mean, if we take this outside of our space, if you have a really solid credit card vendor or bank, especially if it's a smaller bank, they seem to be better at this. You have a pattern on any given day that's outside of your norm. You may get a text message or phone call or just get your card outright declined because your transaction pattern doesn't add up to being, this is the way Chris Johnson normally spends money.
Mm-hmm.
He just dropped $200 at the casino, and his track history is he's never been to a casino. They may even just flag it because it was a casino transaction.
Right.
So let's back up for a step because I'm playing back as we're going through this in my head, our previous imaginary episode. And I may need to do more of these just because it kind of helps me plan out the episode that didn't happen to one that does happen. And it got me thinking about the example that you gave. And you kind of said this, I think you said this really well. When you think about the perimeter in the environment, we've gone from an environment that quite honestly was made up of brick and mortar, even if it's a virtual brick and mortar, to a sponge. We've gone to a rather porous environment. And it used to be, how do we keep this out? Or how do we avoid this from, getting in? But both are true. They're different answers to sort of opposite sides of the same coin. The individual allowing them to get out for certain things versus everything that potentially could get in that's not even specific to somebody on the inside, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we've talked about this as the sponge, and I was thinking about a sponge wiping things up. You might be able to wipe up all the water on the floor, at least absorb a lot of the water, but I can squeeze the sponge and the water is going to come right back out, right? Like this isn't like it's gone. It's not like a towel that's drying the moisture completely out of the floor. When I'm done wiping up, it's still damp. It's still got moisture there. So it's essentially reducing that flow of water, right? Or ensuring that each drop of water coming through is being identified as what it is. I mean, this might be a bad analogy, but the bottom line is you can't stop 100% of what's flowing through that endpoint. That person's activity is now porous where it wasn't before.
I'll give you another bad analogy. So because I don't think there is when you start talking about cybersecurity, it's hard to come up with a good real world analogy, to be honest.
Right. But if you have enough bad analogies, they're only bad to us because we think they're bad. It doesn't mean that someone listening isn't going to go, I'm using that one. That was awesome.
You can combine them and use triangulation.
That's right. That's right. Find an average.
Get to the truth.
That's right.
So I've got 8-year-old twins, and we've been having a lot of fun playing old NES games.
Okay.
And a lot of those games were very, the way they were programmed, you had to do certain things in certain orders.
Yep.
And there were certain just arbitrary barriers that you couldn't get through. If you remember back to some of those games, and you couldn't go back a level, and you couldn't, so they're very structured, and they keep the player in a particular box.
Sure.
Now contrast that with today's modern games, whether it's, Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead Redemption, or, these open world games where you can do almost anything you want in almost any order.
Shoot, you can build your own levels.
Yeah, exactly. So the thought process that went into those different types of games is very different. In the open world scenario, the programmers really had to think about, okay, we can't constrain them artificially, so we have to be essentially prepared for anything.
Right.
And that to me is the difference between a strictly perimeter-based security model, which is like the old school games, and a zero trust model where you're saying, okay, we can't just turn off all trust. We have to trust something, but we have to be very, and now I'm losing words.
Intentional.
Yeah, we have to be very intentional with how we define what we're going to trust. And we have to realize that there's going to be scenarios that maybe we didn't even consider.
Which raises a very cool question. And I'm going to say this. That was a really good analogy. I can relate to that. And it got me thinking. Old school technology, or the old school games, had predictable patterns, right? I don't know if there's a game out there called Pixels. It's a Adam Sandler movie. And it starts out in the 80s with the kids playing and the tournament, and you find out later, I won't give it away, but you find out later that there's some approaches that can be used that are definitely not what we would say are on the up and up. But as the Adam Sandler character is playing, you find out that he's really, really good. Even the first time he plays, he's really good because he sees the pattern that's emerging from how the game was programmed. You fast forward to today, and like you said, there's still a pattern, but it is not easily discernible as a predictable pattern, particularly not predictable by, say, human, intellect. We're not going to pick up on it just because we looked at it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think technology is at a point where if you have the layered approach and your focus is about how do I protect my client or protect my end users or protect my staff, then it's not so much about having to know the pattern as it is about doing everything you can to force someone to go try where the patterns are a lot easier to break through. If I don't want to try hard, right? If I'm in the business of making money by ransoming your computers, then the more time I have to spend to get in your environment is the less time or is time wasted on the many environments that I might have gotten into that were easy to break in.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
We don't protect first, right? So let's go to that next piece. When I think zero trust, I think counterintuitive to the CIA. And most frameworks were built on the premise of confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility. And I think the integrity and accessibility become very complicated when our efforts are too focused on the zero trust model and not focused enough on how do I ensure those three things. If I focus on that zero trust obviously might become an element of it, but because I'm not focused on that, then I'm not putting my client or myself or the end users in a position where, ooh, I didn't think of that. No one can get into it. Hey, at least it's secure.
And I think that's one of the things we had talked about in our rehearsal.
Yeah.
That the frameworks are not built towards a zero trust model.
No.
None of the frameworks that are out there really, none of them fully embrace a zero trust model. And it may be because the technology hasn't quite caught up to that model yet.
Well, I would say even if the technology does catch up, because I will agree with you, I don't think it has, particularly not when we get into the endpoint side of things, because I think that's really where the person or individual involvement starts to make things. We can't predict what everybody will do. We can predict what some people do, and even then we can be wrong because a previous established pattern doesn't equate to a future pattern. I mean, you watch all the NCIS and all the, whether it's serial killers or criminals who rob banks, eventually something gets in the way of them being successful all the time, right? Ego, an environmental variable. I mean, those things all get in the way of that, and it creates a pattern, a change in the pattern, right?
Right.
My thinking is, if you look at the framework itself, I would just say there's three parts to it to get the outcome that we've been talking about. Number one is a framework is a set of tools or guidance, right? A framework is a guidance of controls. You said it before, CMMC, I think this was in the rehearsal. Do this, not that, right?
Yep.
With CUI data, controlled unclassified information, here's how it should be handled. Omnibus rule and HIPAA compliance, it's all about patient health information, do this with the protection of the patient as your primary focus, right? PCI, it's all about the transaction, the credit card data, those kind of things, right? Those are intent framework. It's intent, the guidance. We think about what we do as MSPs, and it's about protect, productivity, efficiencies, keep them operational and alive. You look at any framework, they all have some of that same element to it because they all apply the CIA, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility. And if that is our rule as an MSP, then you can pick any framework. And if you effectively adopt the framework, you can probably apply it to any other framework, right? Because most of them have similar controls and an effort to do something, even if the data set's different, to basically do that across the board. So why do you think at this point, because obviously we had a rehearsal and we talked about some different things, I know, because they're playing back in my head. What are we missing, Bryan? As MSPs, what's the piece that is fundamentally getting in the way of the majority of MSPs being successful in successfully protecting themselves and their clients all the time?
I think it's a mindset. And if I think I know where you're going with this, it's the mindset that it's not about the stack. It's about the process. It's about inventory, and it's about reconciliation.
Just like a checkbook.
Exactly. So you reconcile your checkbook to make sure that, I guess people still do that. I don't, but
well, let's pause for a moment. You don't have to reconcile your checkbook to reconcile your register to go in and look, hey, are those transactions that I'm spending and those deposits, do those correlate to what should be happening in my bank account?
Yes, exactly. So maybe that might even be a better way to put it, as correlation. But
right, the ins and outs, are they my ins and outs, right? Is the money going in and the money coming out? Am I a part of that? Like, am I aware of those things happening? Do I accept them for what they are, or do I disagree with them? I mean, I realize we disagree with a lot of transactions. Like, I could have sworn I didn't tip that much, or any number of things, right? Like, but take this for me back to the cybersecurity stack that we've been talking about, both in our rehearsal and so far on this episode.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think even more fundamentally than that. So we have a really good track record. We have an excellent track record. In fact, I would put up against anyone for securing our clients. And we have a light security stack. We don't have tons and tons of tools in our stack. We're evaluating some more, obviously, always looking. But primarily the big three things: antivirus, DNS protection, and ensuring that users don't have admin privileges. Those are kind of the three fundamental things. But before you ask the question.
No, I got a timeout.
Okay.
You said the term light stack. I don't think that's fair. I think it's saying that while you don't have a lot of products or tools in your stack, it's not to say that your stack isn't strong from a cybersecurity perspective.
Yes, you're right.
I want to be clear about that. You're not saying, hey guys, I have a weak security stack implemented. When you take out the tape measure, mine goes up 2 inches to your 8 inches. We're not talking about how many tools. This is important here to note that this isn't about how many tools.
You're right. And I guess that's what I was trying to say with light, meaning we all have a tendency to just pile on the tools as MSPs. We just go and say, oh, well, this fills this niche, and this fills that niche, and this, and
it doesn't even have to be a niche. Come on. If you see a shiny product, I'm the first person to be like, hey, this looks cool. It solves a problem I didn't know I had, and I want to solve that problem.
But I would say that the secret to our success is being almost fanatical about ensuring that each of those products that we say we've deployed is actually deployed and operational on every device that we say it's deployed on. and ensuring that the configurations that we've put into place, like for example, the no privileged accounts,
You're right.
making sure that that's actually what's happening. And then
Kind of
as you brought
auditing
up,
what you're doing.
yeah, exactly. And as you brought up, I think that's something that MSPs tend not to do. We deploy stuff and we think, okay, it's running, that's great, and then we move on to the next shiny object, and
Well,
don't
now you're
realize that.
talking about MSPs as a whole, right? You have a client, they have a need, you have a product that solves that need, you put the product in, it stands up,
Yep.
it works, and you move on to the next thing.
Yeah. And as you had mentioned, at the other side of inventory,
Yeah.
knowing what should be in your client's environment. So removing anything that shouldn't be and detecting anything new. So if you, like you had mentioned, RMM tools, I know what's supposed to be on my clients' computers as far as RMM.
Right.
So if we see another one, yeah, that's
Right.
pretty easy to know that shouldn't be there, but we had to look to find it.
Right. So which I think is in the rears, we'll say zero trust, right? So you have apps that we know you have to trust because it's 365, it's whatever, Excel, Primavera. I don't know. It's different per client environment, but there is a silent audit that says you need to at least establish beyond the security stack what applications really should be running in here. And while it's not zero trust per se, I think we talked about this before, I would say there's a 0+ or a +1, right? What applications need to be in there. I think silent audits are one of the ways to get there. It made me think about this. The security stack is different than a productivity stack. So if I think about my business and the apps that we use to be, to do printing and to do some other stuff, you've got certain things that have to be in the environment for me to be successful as an employee. One would argue that if you use 10% or more of any application in most business productivity, creativity, those types of things, you're doing a lot of utilization out of that product, right? But when I think about a cybersecurity stack, and you mentioned this, auditing that what's in place is doing what it's supposed to. I don't think your cybersecurity stack can be, hey, we use it like 10 to 15% of what it's capable of doing, right? Like this
Yeah.
is different. And I think we can get ourselves in trouble when we put a product in that solves a problem and we go, man, I put in WebRoot, and for those listening, I literally just use that as an example. This is not to say that this is anything about. So I'll just say product X gets put in. Disregard what I said. Product X gets put in, and oh man, it's just a lot of work to really get it tuned. So I've turned off reporting. It's doing what it's supposed to, right? We've heard that before.
Mm-hmm.
But is that really an acceptable outcome? Like, why is it making a lot of noise? We say this a lot. I will say this because I love the product personally. I've used Avik for years. It can get really noisy. So, like, there are things that I might turn off, but obviously I did so intentionally. One example that I almost turned off was tied to printing. So I work with a school district that we have, like, I think it's like 15 or 20 multifunction copiers. And I didn't know this until I started really looking closely. The guys that were handling our copiers and replaced the toner, they were getting poor readings off of our copiers of like when to replace toner. And they were always almost behind the 8 ball on getting us toner on time or being even late. And so I've got my staff, they're intentionally reaching out and getting toner in advance. So I started running the report. Lo and behold, we were able to shore up that problem. So not a cybersecurity issue at all, but it did uncover some things, and well, it cleaned up my reporting, right? We solved the problem as opposed to ignoring it because it got in the way or it was frustrating. And I think to circle this back and wrap it up, is that not common amongst any of us that have an MSP or have had an MSP? Like, what are the tools? Are they operating at the level that we need them to? And what's keeping us from continuing to dial it in more?
Yeah. And you know what? Most security tools are fairly, I'm going to say they're simple.
Sure.
Because most of them have a limited scope of what they do. You know, there's
Right. They're
not a whole lot
intentional.
of Swiss Army knife.
It's a product
tools
with
out there.
intent.
Yes, exactly.
Like almost laser or scalpel focus, which is why you talked about while you have a light stack, each one of those tools in that stack is known for a specific set of
Right.
services.
And I would contend that you should not put any security tool into production until you know what every one of the settings in that tool does.
That's a fair point.
Have wrestled it to the ground and have thought through the implications of that setting being on or off, or that setting being, 1,000 or 50.
Sure.
Or,
like what happens on scale? Maybe it's not a big deal when you only implement it on the servers, but what happens when you put it on all the endpoints?
Right. Because you know what? Not understanding what a particular function does, that could leave you open and you wouldn't even know it.
So obviously, this was the better version of Zero Trust MSP-1337.
I agree.
Awesome. Bryan, you've said it. Bryan Sullo, Bryan. He's on LinkedIn. Hit him up on LinkedIn. He's a great cybersecurity resource. I have learned a lot today and obviously in the past. But Bryan, thank you for being on the show. For those of you listening, thanks and have a great week.
Thanks, Chris.